Okay, so this chapter is a bit of a mixture. We're going to talk about um, U.S. populace, how it votes, what it looks like when they're voting. We're going to start off talking about a study that's been done multiple times since the 50 called Who Votes. We'll eventually get into talking about how elections run, how campaigns run, some of the concerns that candidates have when they're running through the system. So some of it's obviously pretty apropos given where we're at right now. Um, I suppose I should tell everybody, right? Your uh, voting polls have been open for early voting for about a week now, so you should get out there and vote, right? Play your part. So let's take a look at the statistics and general demographics about voting in the United States. So in the mid to late 50s, we started doing this work. A guy named Robert Dahl started work called Who Votes, and it was essentially the first really in-depth accounting of what America looked like when they go to the polls, right? When they're polling people on who they are, what they look like, where they are, what work they do, what income they make. Right? We really started getting the demographics of the American voter, and it's been done right over and over again since then. And so what we're looking at now is really on this side the kind of general consensus that's in play today about voting. And the first thing that we noticed is that um, it is a class-based exercise. The folks that vote overwhelmingly are higher educated and are of higher incomes than compared to those that do not vote. Right. So we know it's been shown over and over and over again that the folks that have a higher level of education, the folks that earn more money, um, show up to vote, and they vote much more consistently than those on the other side of it. Why do you think that might be the case? So, right, we know that they're more educated, but why would being more educated? So, if they're higher income, they probably have more to protect property-wise. That's true. Why would their education be something that encourages them to vote versus those that have less education? What would be it's true, right? And there is something there, but I'm right. What do you think it is? Hopefully, that's exactly what it is. They've had a little more training, a little more education, a little more discussion and debate, and they see more of how the system works because they've been trained more a little bit in it. Maybe a class like this, right, helps the higher educated, right, go, gee, I should really vote, right? There's a lot of things they're doing that are going to impact me, right? So I should get out there and have a voice in it. Um, there's also a little more going on to it, though. Um, think about it from the less educated perspective or the lower income perspective. Why don't they vote more? Right, we can see the argument that if you're more educated, you've been kind of time. That's a good one. Why is time an issue? Probably, right? Probably working more. Probably not only working more, um, right? But we know if you're on the lower income scale, right, you're having to work more to make enough money to make it, right? Just day to day. So, when we look at folks in the lower income classes, a lot of them are working two jobs, right? Trying to make ends meet, and that doesn't leave a whole lot of time, right? It's not necessarily that they think it could be, but it's not necessarily that they think that voting is useless or doesn't have an impact. Right? But in the day-to-day scheme of getting things done, voting falls way down on the list when you're trying to make enough money to put food on the table and clothes on the kids and pay the bills and right. Having an hour or so to go vote would be nice, but exactly priorities, right? So um, there's another element of it when you look at the flip side of it. Those folks that are on in jobs that are paying better generally are not working by the hour, right? There's a practice there, right? The lower income jobs usually you're clocking in and clocking out. And every minute you're on the clock's when you're getting paid, and every minute you're not on the clock, you're not getting paid. But for those of us that have gotten into a position where we have a salary, right, we have more, generally speaking, more flexibility about our working time, about our working hours. And when something like voting comes up, right, it's time to go vote in an election, without necessarily taking time off, right, we can manipulate our time, manage our time to get to the polls and vote, and it still work. If you're working two jobs, or if all the jobs you're working require you to clock in and clock out, you are not just having to make time, you're literally losing money, right? I've been either working for the state or teaching my whole career. Both of those jobs afford me plenty of time and flexibility to go vote and never impact my income. Not everybody can say that, right? So we need to be cognizant of the fact that the class you're in educational wise or the class you're in based on income brings with it a lot more than just how much education you have or how much money you make, right? Being in that class has impacts on what you're capable of doing and when you're capable of doing things. And for 20 years, right, I managed folks in state government. And, when it was election time, a couple weeks before the election, we just sit down and say, okay, everybody tell me when you want to go vote, right? Whether you want to take, manage your clock before and go early vote or whether you want to go on election day. And we just moved people's schedules around to let them have a couple hours, right? They didn't lose money. They didn't lose anything. We just managed their time, right? Now, of course, the state employees, they're going to make sure that they get out there to vote. But the fact is that that type of job allowed me to move my employees around and give them the time that they needed to go vote, right? And all we had to do was schedule, right? So it's like, okay, I've got two people going here and two here, and if you want to go, here's some open times. Do any of these work for you? So not everybody gets that opportunity based on the work that they have, and so it's an interesting kind of perspective on how our economy works, how our jobs, right, impact what we can and can't do. And the United States is one of the few places really that doesn't make some kind of nationwide exception to election day, right, where we schedule time for, make it a holiday or make it a weekend or something, right, that where we make it so that needing to work doesn't necessarily impact your ability to get to the polls. In a lot of the Western European countries, it's a paid holiday, and so you get paid just as if you'd worked that day, as long as you go vote. Right, and if you don't go vote, they fine you, and they fine you the cost of one day's pay, right? So because they were going to pay you that whole day, and you didn't do the thing that you were getting paid to do that day. So, I mean, not everybody has to do it that way, but right. But there are a lot of different ways to do it than the ways that we do. Why do you think that we don't have national elections on the weekend? Wouldn't that be a better time as far as flexibility goes? And there's actually a very good reason why we don't. So what are the built-in biases that you're thinking of, Lauren? So people in politics have more money, therefore they don't want elections to be on the weekend because of why? They only want people that have the money like they do to vote or maintain control. Okay, so I think there's certainly some truth that there's a lot of control that those folks running for office want to have over the election process. And then I'm sure they're trying to do that. It's a non-business day. It's their weekend. So you're saying that the people in politics don't want to have to work on the weekend on a non-business day. So there's that too. Don't interfere with my weekend off. All the rest of you. But what about something like religions that tell you you're not supposed to be doing anything? Right? You're supposed to be a day of rest. Right. And so for some religions, the fact of needing to go vote and it being on a weekend, which would be a religious day, because Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, somebody's religion is on every one of those days, right? Would maybe keep a whole religious segment of the population from voting if we did it then. Right. So that's actually one of the main reasons why we don't do it over a weekend, is because we didn't want election days falling when it might impact folks' religion. So that limits it. If you're going to take that out, you're kind of going Monday through Thursday, right? Are your opportunities for that. And right, as we can see, when we're opening the polls, we're opening them early, right? For early voting, they're open now all week, right? For a limited amount of time. And then the actual election day is going to be on a Tuesday, right? It's always on a Tuesday. So when we were trying to pick days, to have an election day, Tuesday is actually kind of one of the best. There's nothing religious there. There are no big major holidays where people would be traveling, right? You take a 3-day weekend, or you have a weekend that closes the federal government on a Monday, so you don't really want to do it there. You have other ones that sometimes fall on Fridays, so Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Well, Wednesday, people got church and stuff on Wednesday night. So now you're down to Tuesday and Thursday, right? So there's actually a lot of practical thoughts going into why we do it on Tuesday. But there goes more back, I think, to what you guys are looking at as far as built-in biases and all that on, why don't we make election day Tuesday a national holiday, right? So that those folks that are clocking into work have a day off, not going to conflict with any religious things, and they can go vote, right? We could do that. And that might be where those biases and stuff start kind of make some sense about why we don't do that, maybe. What other arguably good reason would there be for not having a national election day where you're off, a holiday on a national election day? There are groups of people that make arguments about, right, that you shouldn't make it easy to vote. And what are they thinking about? Where are they coming from? It could be some of those people that typically read are not wanting you to vote, but let's assume these people do want you to vote. Why would a person that says, I want everybody to vote, but I don't want to make it as easy as possible, but what could they be thinking? Okay, so the first one there from Lauren is common people maybe aren't as educated on the issues, and therefore, and the argument would go on to say, and therefore shouldn't be voting because they don't know what they're voting about, right? So I think Lauren's onto what I was kind of pushing us toward. Lante, what are you talking about the numbers?
I think I may have gotten the the question mixed up. I think you were asking why would they want everyone to vote? I mean, of course, because they want the numbers, regardless of who is voting. They want to see people.
Right. I got you. Yeah. The folks that want everyone want to see those big numbers. We want to see everybody get out there. The folks that are saying, well, maybe not, are more of the, when we look at the lower income peoples, the lower educated people, a lot of times they're not voting based on policy or based on perspective. They show up because they feel obligated and they just vote. And that vote doesn't mean as much if you haven't put something in. The Lauren says it's relevant to the parties. I think you're onto something there, Lauren, as well. Where are you going with that? Is this tied back to your right, the issues and debate the party platforms, right? So this is tied back to your previous comment about not as educated on the issues, right? Got it. Yes, that makes sense to me. It took me to put it together there. And Colton, you bring up the issue of voter fraud. What are you thinking with that?
If it's easier to vote, then people who aren't supposed to vote, it's easier for them to vote.
Okay, I got what you're. Okay, so you're telling us that if the process is simple, it's probably easier to infiltrate the process or to get around it and then commit voter fraud. And I guess there's certainly some elements of that to it. So we haven't had just a whole lot of voter fraud that we've been able to put our finger on. We know it happens occasionally, and when we do see it happen, most of the time it's not. When you talk to the people go to court, right, and it's coming out, they are making the argument that they thought they could vote, right, that they didn't think they were committing fraud, and they thought. Now the court doesn't always buy that, of course, but now we have seen a couple instances in states where you can fill out your ballot. You get a ballot in the mail, and you can fill it out. There's no problems. Usually, the ballots themselves are pretty tamper-proof in a sense. There are a lot of checks and things that they do on the back end to make sure that things are working. One of the things, though, that's kind of been an issue is that some states allow for mail-in ballots. They'll mail them out, and they allow people to go house to house, collect those completed ballots. And sometimes we've had some cases where the folks collecting them have violated the integrity of the ballot after they pick them up, right? So they change the ballot if they think they can get away with it. They lose some ballots, right, that they don't want to see get counted or something like that. So none of those have been the cases that we've seen like that have been massive, but some of them have been, right. We had one in North Carolina that was a pretty big deal. And so that's the case where it's a little more convoluted about how the ballot gets back and how it's turned in. Here in Texas, if you were eligible to get an absentee or a mail-in ballot mailed to you that you then submit, you went to turn it in, you have to turn it in, and there's someone there to check you and your ID and the ballot, right? So before it goes into the box, so they're, and then you get that ballot once it's been checked off as being submitted, right? There can't be another one submitted like it because it's been checked off. So, so Lauren's saying here, would time and resources to process a large number of votes be another issue? It can be. It certainly can be. It depends on the laws of the state, right? So each state has been given the authority, right, to control their elections. And so some states have laws that say, here's how long we have to count all the ballots. Some say 3 days, some say 1 day, some might have weeks. That law might be something that has to be that has no wiggle room at all, right? So it could be something like you've got 72 hours from the time that the election ends, turn in all the votes. Well, resources and time are going to be very important then. And so if everybody votes, obviously you've got to have more time or more resources or some combination to balance that out and address those larger number of votes. And we're seeing some of those issues in this election already, right? We're seeing longer lines, people having to stand in line longer to vote. Right, we saw here in Texas where Governor Abbott said, hey, if you're going to have a ballot box, you're going to have one per county, right, for security reasons. We don't have the resources and stuff to protect a bunch of ballot boxes. Whether you buy the argument or not, it's up to you, but there were multiple ballot boxes in Houston and Austin and Dallas, right, all the big metropolitan areas, and he came back and said, nope, one, they say per county, I think one per county, right? Now, on a security issue, if you've got one ballot box per county, you've got to make sure everybody that's using it is using it properly. That's pretty easy, right? You only got to focus on that one place. But it makes it a whole lot harder for everybody to come through that process and get their ballots turned in. And if you're in a county like most counties in Texas are, that's pretty big, that's going to mean traveling a fair bit, right? I mean, Harris County is massive, and there's millions and millions of people there. And if they all go to the one ballot box in Harris County, you can see the problems that's going to cause. So now, on the other hand, Texas has early voting where we have a couple weeks, right, essentially, where the polls are already open, and except for I think 7 to 7 during the weekdays, and then I don't know, Saturday maybe 7 to 7 also. I think Sunday's 1 to 6. So in that sense, if you take advantage of the early voting in Texas, we actually do give you an opportunity to avoid the election day line. And I voted this morning. Now I went early. I was there when the polls opened at 7, and I stood in line for, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes. And so not a big deal at all, right? So so the early voting is a nice way to, if you're going to vote in person, right? Now with the pandemic, some people are nervous about that. Although I have to say that where I went today up here in North Austin, my poll was really well run. The people who were did a nice job. So get out there and check it out. But we were all social distance, right? And we had the ballots all set up so that you weren't right next to each other, and you could walk through the system without having to get close to anybody. So it was all good. And then everybody wore masks, right? So I think they're doing a pretty good job, at least at my polling place, indicative of the others that are around. They did a decent job. So, right. Now that may not be true everywhere. So we have to be paying attention to that kind of thing. But so the resources that go into it, both from the county, are important, and the state. But it's also, like, this first idea here about it being class-based is the resources that we as voters have to expend, right, to be able to get there. And the higher educated and the higher income, one can afford the resources better. Two, can probably manage their resources given the types of jobs they have, so that they can manage that better. So that's where that's coming from. So it shouldn't surprise us. It doesn't. Right? I've had students who go, well, it's because the lower income people aren't paying attention, they don't want to vote. I don't know that you can necessarily make that case, right? I think there are costs, right, that we have to consider that impact how people can vote, the ability to vote. That some people have to juggle and some don't. If you're a single parent, and you're working a job where you're clocking in and out, so your ability to vote is on the fringes of then you've got to probably either take your child with you to vote, which is, if you end up standing in line, it's going to be a bit of a hassle, or you have to find someone to babysit while you do it. That's also a hassle, and may cost you money, right? So there's things to consider there. The second element here is that older folks tend to vote at a higher clip or more than younger folks do. And that shouldn't really surprise any of us, right? So Lawrence says, if that single parent relies on public transportation. Yeah, if you don't have, right, if you have to manage your time to get there as well as your time to be there and then time to get home, and it's just, it costs more, right? It just literally costs more. And time is money. So that's right. The barriers to voting are higher on a lot of people than we want time to realize. Which, right, is exactly true about older voters versus younger voters, right? The cost for older voters to vote is usually lower, right? Usually lower. They probably, the older you get, the closer you get to having a lot more free time. Voting doesn't take time away from work, right? The younger you are, you're in school or you're working your first jobs, getting your career going, you're having young children. All of these kind of things are definitely going to impact how you're going to get to the polls. And to be frank, I remember when I was a younger voter, and it was, hey, I'm doing more fun stuff than wanting to pay attention to what's going on in the elections and voting, and that's just not on my radar, right? And so, this study that's been done over and over again is just telling us or describing to us who the voters are, right? And so we know that, right? That the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. Next demographic that we can look at here is the demographic on race, and given the history, racial history of the United States, it shouldn't surprise us, right, that Caucasians, right, voted a higher participation rate than minorities did, right? Caucasians have not had to really fight, especially males, to vote, right? That's exactly who we've opened the door for since the beginning of this experiment in democracy. White women, right? You had to work for it. Anybody not white, people of color, all of you have had to work for it, right? And the doors have not been open, and we not only have they not been open, we've been actively locking them on the backside, right, to keep them from being opened. If you look at some of the things that we have done, and so it shouldn't surprise us that folks that have been systematically kept out of voting for long periods of time and have just really getting the opportunity to vote are, one, skeptical of the process. Two, right, those same folks that have been marginalized in voting have been marginalized in the economy, have been marginalized in education. Those things that would help you be in a higher class educationally or income-wise, and therefore vote more often, right? So you see how these kind of things all kind of can tie together, right? So we're doing better there, but we're not done with this, right? We're not making sure that this happens the way it's supposed to yet. So we're still working on that issue. Another interesting finding that's been true long periods of time, that those folks north of the Mason-Dixon vote more often than those folks south of the Mason-Dixon. Hey, what do you think is going on there? Why do Northerners vote at a higher participation rate or have a higher participation rate in elections than Southerners do? There are a lot more rural regions, bigger rural regions south. So there might be a geography that you've got to, for a long time, right? the South did have the poll taxes, and in other words, you couldn't pay the tax to go to the polls, you couldn't afford to vote. But this is still true today. Generally speaking, those folks in the north of the Mason-Dixon line vote more often than those south of it do. And when we ask people about this, especially in the South, why we have lower voting numbers than those folks in the North, part of the reason we get that feeds into this distinct description is that there's a higher level of I lost the word. We don't have the same level of confidence in the South in government than the folks in North do. We do think it's a privilege and not necessarily a right. We also know that we have, and Charles, this goes to I think what you're doing with your paper, right? We know that it's harder to get your voting rights back in the South, and that we do people of color in jail at a higher clip than we do Caucasians, right? So all feeds in there together, right? But you could take, right, folks that have absolutely nothing that prevents them from voting, right? Caucasian white men in the South, and they're not going to waste their time, right? They're not going to. They don't. Those votes don't matter anyway. That's just that the national government. We shouldn't be doing anything with that anyway, right? Still, right, a perception that probably comes all the way from the end of the Civil War forward, right? That the folks in the South shouldn't trust the federal government. Or, of course, folks in the North, the federal government was their government, right? And so there's still some elements there of that distrust, right? That's not going to work for us. And so there's a lot going on there, right? But it's interesting to look at these demographics and figure out what it is that's feeding into this. The next one is really simple, right? If you're a government employee, you vote at a very high rate. And that should shock no one, right? That should shock no one. Government employees, by the very nature of their employment, right, know that they're picking their bosses, know that the voting decisions may impact whether they still have a job or not. Plus, the government gives them time off to go vote. So they have both, as we would say in criminal terms, motive and opportunity to do this. And so government employees, right, are always going to be participating at a very high rate. We didn't think about it much until we started seeing the numbers come out when we were doing these studies. Today, we can say that the difference in gender does not impact new votes very much. Obviously, prior to 1920, it mattered a lot. Since 1920, it's not only equalized, but women actually participate at a little higher rate than men do. So that's why we say the gender is not as important anymore, right? And so that's a good thing that we can point at that and see that that's one of the things that's kind of gone by the wayside. This last one here is kind of goofy when you just read it, right? But again, these are my lecture notes. They're just telling me what to talk about. But let me explain what this means, because when you say, registered people who are registered to vote, but more often those that are not registered, well, duh, because the non-registered folks can't vote, right? That's almost a tautology, right? What this really means is that when we're out there talking to people and asking them if they're going to vote, and we say, so are you planning on in this upcoming election? And we'll get the answer, yes, I plan to vote. Almost everybody wants to say yes, right? Because they know that's the right answer. We'll follow that question up with, well, are you currently registered to vote? And what we find out is that when you put those two things together, the folks that said they were going to vote and were registered did. The folks that said they were going to vote but weren't registered yet never got registered, right? And therefore didn't vote. So at the time you're trying to put all this together and figure out who's going to vote and who's not going to vote, knowing if their voter's registered or not is a big indicator of whether they will actually vote or not. If you remember when we were looking at some of the polls, right? Some of the samples that they pulled out, it was LV 1500, right? Likely voter, and then some were RV, registered voter. We should give the RV responses to surveys a lot more weight because, right, we're asking them who you're going to vote for, and they're a registered voter. Odds are really high. That's not only are they going to vote for who they said, but they're going to vote. Whereas the likely voter may be telling us the truth that, hey, yeah, I'm going to vote for this person, and that's exactly what they intend. But then they didn't get registered, so they couldn't vote. And so, that gives us a little bit of a discrepancy in what's going on in that polling when we have people that are registered as voters and non-registered, and we're treating those results, those answers, with the same weight. Does that make sense? Any questions about this slide? This might be my favorite slide, piece of data about voting that there is. It's a great chart pulled out of the textbook, and it's this is based on 2012 data, but while the numbers change from election to election, the percentages are pretty standard over time. So this is looking at, right, 2012, the total population of the United States was estimated at almost 314 million people. Okay, out of that 314 million people, folks that were old enough to vote, right, 18 or more, had about 235 million people. So that's how many people, right, had met the criteria of being old enough to vote, voting age population. Then you step down one more and look at the people that are actually voting eligible. That means they're not just of the voting age, right, but actually could, were eligible to vote for all of the reasons, right? Weren't a felon, were, had a residency established, things like that. So your voting eligible population, we're down to 222 million people. Of that 222 million people, right, that's 57%, right, of them voted. That's our, right, of the folks that could vote, that were eligible to vote, 57% of them actually voted. Okay, so that's actually, that was actually a pretty good election year, right? A lot of times we're lower than that. Of those 222 million people that were eligible to vote, 153 million of them actually registered to vote, right? Which represents 60% of the voting eligible population now voting, right? And so, right, we get down to the end, the number of votes we actually had was almost 133 million votes. That's a good question, Brittany, and we're really not sure. Normally, right, the answer would be pretty self-explanatory. You'd think, oh, it's dangerous to vote because that requires you to be out and about around people, so it will probably go down, like the number of voters. But we're seeing record-breaking turnout right now. And I think a lot of people are looking at this pandemic situation and they're looking at the voting situation. They're going, I'm going to find some way to vote, right? And there's actually, it's almost a kind of perverse situation where the COVID makes it harder. And because it's harder, people are stepping up to do it, right, in a sense. Now, it could also be motivations for the folks that were have an opportunity to vote for or against, right? So, if COVID, if you're out here looking at the COVID situation and going, I expected the government to handle this and handle it well, and that's not happening, and therefore I think I need to new people in there, then COVID is going to motivate people to vote because they don't think it got handled well. If you think we're handling about as good as we could, right, then it's going to be right more of the, hey, I know this barrier's there, but I'm not going to let it stop me. Yes, I had at my voting poll there was sanitizer going in, there was sanitizer on the inside of the poll, and there's sanitizer leaving the poll. Right, so there was goop all over the place. Right, they even had little things for the markers, right, that you're going to use on there. They had pencils to let you use the erasers. They were automatically sanitizing the pencil that you were going to use. Right, so it went through this thing and sanitized it. Right. So yes, I think the folks that are doing the volunteer work to man our polls have taken COVID very seriously and are trying everything they can to make sure that this is as safe of experience as possible for people, and we should appreciate that. But yeah, so normally I would think, Brittany, yes, it would be lower, but we're seeing this across a bunch of states, right? As Lauren pointed out, early voting records. Right? People are going into early voting at a higher clip than we've ever seen them do it before. And there's no reason to think that that's going to tail off through election day. So I think this year we might have an outstanding turnout. It may be a record-breaking election season, and which would be a great thing, right? That more people are actually voting. Well, quarantine has put a lot of people to the side, right? And they've lost jobs and they're sitting at home. So maybe they have had time and opportunity to put their thought to what's going on and what they think government should or shouldn't be doing, and is government doing what they think about that. So I have an answer for you, but I think that's there's some insight there that we can think about. So it's going to be really, from a political science perspective, I'm going to be very much interested in the voting turnout numbers on the back end of this election. Not just at the national level either. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see state by state comparisons between this election, elections in the midterm 2 years ago, presidential election 4 years ago, right? And to look at those over time and try to see what explains what happens. So now, of course, if some of the we have voting problems, right, where people aren't able to get into the polls while they're trying, or the polls close or something, or their ballots or large numbers of ballots are delegitimated and pushed to the side. That's going to be interesting for a whole different reason. But there's a lot going on this election period. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to have a lot of things to keep track of and to watch and to pay attention to. Right, we're 2 weeks from today, right? So it's election day. So how do you verify legitimate signatures? Well, it's a very good question. It's an amateur guessing game, to be really, really honest about it. So when you register to vote, you sign a registration card. So you have a signature on there. Plus you have a signature on usually your driver's license application or something. So your state will have signatures. A lot of states have the ability to print off, like, this is the name of the person, this is the address they live on, this is an image of the signature that we have on file for them. Now, right, so those ballots, right, that are mailed in that don't have any kind of verification, and require somebody on the back end to look at the ballot, look at the signature, and compare it to the other signature. Most states try not to do that. Most states instead have some process where when you're signing your ballot, somebody else is there also signing the ballot, testifying that you are who you say you are. Or you're turning that ballot in by hand, and somebody's validating your driver's license. States can require you to send in a secondary signature, right? So like a photocopy of your driver's license or state issued ID or something has a signature on it. So if they have stuff to look at. But in the end, somebody's probably looking at the signatures, trying to figure out if they kind of match, right? And most of us, right, if we're not paying a lot of particular attention to our signature, do sign it the same way. I've often wondered, and I have nothing to back this speculation up with, but I've often wondered on really important documents like your ballot, if you don't slow down, take more time, and you actually end up signing it, and it looks different than when you would do a signature on a check or a signature on some other form, right? And so they look different because you were trying to be particular, right? Oh, this is an important one. I really got to sign this, right? Although if you hopefully it'll be good enough, right? States do have the ability, based upon the laws that they pass, to shuttle ballots off to the side that are questionable, and then keep track of that, and then see how close elections are and whether they have to spend time verifying those ballots. So in other words, if you've got let's say there are 10,000 ballots cast in an election, and you've got 300 that you're genuinely curious about whether they're good or not, but the difference between the results of the election are 400 or 500 votes, well, it doesn't matter whether those 300 are legitimate or not, right? So you don't have to worry about it. They're not going to flip the election. That's the other thing that's going on the back end, is that, right, we know where we are with all of our legitimate ballots, and that can tell us whether we've got to spend the resources, the time, and effort on working on the questionable ones or not. So, if any of you remember the Gore-Bush election, it's a while back now, but they were using voting machines where an actual punch card went into the machine, and then you punched what you wanted. It was supposed to knock what they call as a chad, which is a perforated piece of paper. It's supposed to punch that out and leave a hole, which lets them then run this ballot through a machine, and it finds all the holes, and that's what it counts. But there was a high error rate, right, of either mistake on the way the cards were printed or the way they're loaded in the machine, or the accuracy of the punch in the machine. And not all of those chads separated completely. And so there's pictures out there. I bet I can find one real quick that'll show you what we're talking about. Of what's called a hanging chad. See if I can get an image of a hanging chad. So here we go. Let me see if I can pop this over here. Where's the photo? There you go. So as you can see, this guy's here with a magnifying glass looking right at a ballot, and you can see the holes punched out in it. But there's possibilities, right, that the punch right isn't clean. And if it's not clean, the chad doesn't fall out. And he's trying to decide, well, is this a mistake that this chad's halfway punched out, or is it can I count it? Is it clear? Is it verifiable? Right, and this is the kind of weirdness that can go on, not just in verifying signatures, right, but in trying to, here's a picture over here, so we can get that one. To come up. These guys are trying to figure out and trying to come to a conclusion about whether there's a good ballot there or not. Right? Can they count this, or do we need to discard it? And we tell, and they're looking at the top of this ballot, which is where the presidential, right, vote is. They're trying to decide on, is it Gore or is it Bush, right? Can we see something there that definitively tells us what we're trying to find? And that's true of, right, when you get down to it, what they're going to be doing with signatures on mail-in ballots as well, right? They're just going to be trying to visually verify that they've got something good that's working there. Okay. So, so to get back kind of where we were, right? In the end of it, right out of 314 million people in the U.S., we get down to it, and you get 133 million people that are voting, right? There's a lot of folks, right, falling out there, right? You're losing about, what is it, 170, 184 million people or something, right? Some of them for good reasons, not old enough, not eligible, right? But a lot of them, right, we could have a lot higher turnout, right? If all of the voting eligible folks, right, were there, and right, out of this 222 million, right, if all of those were registered and voting, right, we'd have, what is that, 90 million more people, right, that could have been trying to help decide an election for us. So when you think about it that way, it's almost a third of the folks in the country either can't vote, right, or don't. And when you look at how many, you've got 133 million that did vote and 90 million that might, could have, and didn't. I mean, that's a huge amount to make a difference, right? And that's where we are in the U.S., right? So it's kind of crazy. Here's just a little bit about the practice of voting that we've had over time, broken out by age groups, by voting age groups. So, earlier I told you that the older you are, the more you vote, right? A little bit of that's right. You can see that that's true, pretty much from the middle 80s, right? This light blue line, right, is your 65 and older folks, and they're voting at a 70% clip almost. Where most of our, college age, right, we're not doing so good at 38%, right? That's a number, right, that could have a dramatic impact if we could get folks in these lower brackets to actually participate. This year at 50, just under 50%, right, is our 25 to our 25 to 44, right? So, right, between 18 and 44, we got a big chunk of people, right, that aren't voting. Well, we talked about why that's the case, but there's a lot of room to be made up there, right? So we should be working that number a lot. This is voting rates based on ethnicity. Now you'll notice the up and down pattern here. That's because we're looking at what we call midterm elections, right? Which is a national election where there's not a presidential election on the ballot, and then presidential elections, right? Midterm, presidential, midterm. So one thing we know just by looking at this is that when we have a presidential race happening, we got more people participating, right? So the presidency, the race for the presidency motivates people to get out there and vote. And a lot of the times, right, it's because it's just the more visible election that's happening. It's the one that we can see easiest and pay attention to the easiest. But frankly, it's the least important probably on a day-to-day basis. Right? What the president does on a day-to-day basis impacts you as an individual most of the time, the least. Not to say that they don't, right, impact you, because certainly their decisions do impact you. But what's going on at your local and state levels has a much larger day-to-day impact than what the president's doing on a day-to-day. Unless maybe you're, working in federal government or you're a military folk or somebody like that, right? Not that signing laws into bills into law and tax policies and things like that won't impact you, but you'll have a lot more impact on the other ones. So we really ought to be paying more attention to those local elections and those state elections, which means these midterm ones are just as important. So here you can look at the voting rates of folks based on their race or ethnicity. And you can see that, while there are differences, right, gaps between the ethnicities here, the trend is the same, right? They go up about the same, they go down about the same. Sometimes, right, they change a little bit. You look here at the non-Hispanic Black vote in 2006 in the mid-30s, and then we would expect it probably somewhere right in the 50 to 60 range in a presidential election, and it bangs out at 70. Obviously, right, got Obama running for office and getting elected in 2008, and that motivated a lot of the non-Hispanic Blacks that didn't participate prior, right? 10% jump, right, from the previous election. So, obviously race and ethnicity matter. Seeing someone that looks like you, that may have had some experience similar to you, speaks to people when they're, trying to decide whether they're going to vote for somebody or not. So it's very important that, right, we can tell by looking at these numbers, it's very important that people pay attention to and are aware of, right, the ethnicity and race, and that's going to motivate folks to participate. And so we know that for a fact. Hispanics have been kind of the group lagging the most, right? On the bottom of this, you'll see that some of that changed. They almost, right, the presidential years, they'll participate a little more and they'll start matching others, which is our kind of inclusive group of non-Hispanic Black. We've got Hispanic and we've got non-Hispanic Black, and then others is everybody else that's not non-Hispanic White, which is, we've got better numbers than this. We could break it out more. American Indian, Indian American, right, which is India from the continent of India versus Native American or First Peoples. Right, we've got Asian Americans, right. So we've got a lot more that goes on that we can actually identify, but these are the four major groups that we tend to lump them into to try to get some meaning out of it. So you can see the difference here, and there's a gap, right, between Hispanics and others, and non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic blacks, right? Those two groups, you see them voting a much tighter. And that's only, right, you see this, it's kind of there. Something happened in 94, right, for non-Hispanic Blacks. They didn't participate at the same level. But then it's, right, getting higher and more participatory for non-Hispanic Blacks. That's good. Now we got to get the rate of participation higher for Hispanics and all the rest of the folks in the U.S. that are down in these groups here. I mean, ideally, regardless of what the turnout number is, it would be really just a good thing if we didn't see a difference based on race and ethnicity, right? If everybody that was voting eligible, regardless of race or ethnicity, were participating at the same rates. Now, obviously, that's, right, a challenge for us. Some of it's a systemic challenge. In other words, there are things in place that make it difficult. Some education and income we've talked about, right, as different impacts that go along with race and ethnicity. So all of these things are kind of there, but you can see clearly what's going on with these numbers, right? So here's your education breakdown. It just doesn't get any clearer, right? Purple is postgraduate, meaning they have a education beyond a bachelor's degree. Some college to college graduate is the green here. High school graduates the red. Non-high school graduates the blue. Right? There's no crossing over. These are 4 completely distinct voting patterns, turnout rates, based on education. So those of you, right, you're in this class, you're already in the green, right? You're already in the second highest level. Just right, you're going to vote at a higher rate than anybody except postgraduate folks, right? Let me just make sure y'all see there's my sticker, right? Postgraduate vote right there. Right? That's from this morning. Go get your stickers. Get out there and vote. Again, right? We've talked a lot about how a lot of different factors vary into whether people can get the opportunity to vote, take the opportunity to vote. And generally, the higher your education, the easier it's going to be, and the more emphasis you've already put on it yourself. So those two things go together, right? So, you know, the data is just very, very clear on this, right? We still see the same up and down variation between midterm election and presidential election, right? You still see that same pattern, the zigzag pattern that we saw previously, but you know, there's always the gap between the groups. So there's obviously some impact that education is having there. It's not the only impact, but there's some, right? So given all that, right, we talked about all of these factors, all of these demographics, some of the challenges, right? An interesting question to ask, right, is an economical question, right? A question from an economics perspective, what we call a cost-benefit analysis perspective, and is it rational to vote, right? Given that there are barriers to voting, given right the things you have to do, especially the lower income range that you get into or the lower education range that you get into, maybe the more rural area you get into, right? Your costs go up. We know this, right? And so from a cost-benefit analysis, you would sit down and say, well, okay, does the act of voting and what that gets me as a benefit, does that equal or exceed the cost that I'm going to have to vote? But in an economics perspective, if you're looking at this, you know, in economics, we're saying, is it rational? Is it economically rational to vote? If your cost exceeds your benefit, then the answer is no. Right? Why would you pay literally time, blood, sweat, tears, money to vote if you know the benefit of that vote is not going to equal that cost? So, right, the rationality here is, right, is that how we make our decision? Do we make this voting decision rationally? Or do we, right, is it cheaper, right? Do we get more out of our vote at cost? Or do we just pay the cost even when we're not going to get as much out of it as we think? And it's not an easy answer. Right? It's not an easy answer because a lot of factors come into play. It's not just a strict economic balance argument that people go through, right? Economists would like us to be that way, right? Just you add all these things up and you look at how they balance out, and that makes your decision for you. But that's not how people do things. I mean, sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. But there are a couple other things that come into play here. What do you think it is, especially for folks that are having to lose money or make a lot of adjustments to their daily life, right, for them to be able to vote? What is it that motivates them to take all that effort and go vote when they know, really, you sit down and talk to them and say, hey, is the president really going to, who's president going to impact your life that much? And they'll, you know, they're like, well, yeah, but no. But they do the work anyway. Why do they do that? What is it that's motivating them? I saw a picture on my, I'm old, so don't laugh at me, on my Facebook feed today, of a friend of mine, and she was taking her father, who can no longer drive, and driving him to the polls today so that he could vote. She took a picture, right, of him with his walker going to the car so he could go vote. This dude's almost dead. I don't mean to be too crass about it. This dude's almost dead. He is working himself to get to those polls, right? The cost to him is quite a bit, right? I mean, he's got time, obviously. He's old, he's retired, he's not working, but I mean, he's working to get there. What is it that motivates someone to do that, right? It's not probably just the politics. It's probably not just the decisions that are going to be made by the government. Okay, so you disrespectful to your ancestors who couldn't. I mean, that's exactly right what motivates people, right? I mean, to go beyond the cost of voting. Something like, hey, this right is something that people earned, right? And we see this really, really big way for people that are naturalized citizens, right? That came to the U.S. and weren't citizens, and then took all the tests and did all the studying and then took the oath. And right, and then there, when we talk to their children, they'll say the exact same thing, right? They worked for it, and I'm not going to take it for granted now that I've got it. That's worth a ton, right? That perspective, right? This obligation that Lauren's bringing out here to vote is also something that's right, got a lot of privilege and it, you know, carries a lot of meaning besides just who the vote picks, right? For being able to participate in the process, being able, right, to go to the polls and cast your vote and demonstrate that you're participating and to fulfill that duty, right, as that obligation that you have as a citizen. Those are motivations that go deep, and they go a lot deeper, I think, than what is it costing me to vote, and am I going to get the results that I want out of it, right? I think we see that a lot, right? When we talk to people and we ask, what is it that's motivating you to vote? They don't just say, this is the analysis that I've done, or this is the expectations of results that I want. A lot of people are, right, maybe not happy with a lot of what they're seeing there, but right, they're citizens, it's part of their job, they owe it to their country, they owe it to their ancestors who've earned this for them, right? Ones that have fought in wars, ones that have marched and protested, right? Whatever the case might be, right? This is a hard-won ability that we have as citizens to vote, and it should be protected, and we should participate in it, right? So that goes a long way to kind of undercutting the argument for rationality of voting, but it's still there, right? I mean, you could certainly sit down and do a pros and cons kind of approach to voting and go, look, you know what? The cons are a lot higher. The cost to me is a lot more than anything. I'm not going to do it. And we hear people do that, and that should be a motivation to us to try to change the system, not to make it less secure or anything like that, but to make sure that we have the most secure but easiest process possible to allow citizens to exercise their vote. That's obviously not always the case, right? Obviously not always the case. Okay, so just a couple of minutes in class left. Shifting topics here big time, so I'm going to stop for the day. And we'll pick up in move away from voting behaviors and things like that, where we talked about who the voters are, and we'll move into how we hold these elections, how we campaign, and how that impacts us individually when we're looking at candidates for office, right? So we'll pick up with that tomorrow.